So this is chapter 17 on managing data and introducing data analysis. So here are your learning objectives. First, to understand the different ways of analyzing quantitative data, followed by qualitative data. And then third, you'll be able to outline the 4 stages of data analysis. And lastly, begin to analyze data and ask critical questions of data analysis. So as an introduction, in a research project, data is the evidence gathered by the researcher for the purpose of the research. So there are essentially 2 different kinds of data, quantitative and qualitative data. So quantitative data are numerical data, data in the form of numbers or data that can readily be transformed into numerical form. Qualitative data are non-numerical data. So a data set is the complete collection of data gathered for the research project. So there are 2 different approaches to data analysis. So the process of analyzing quantitative data and the process of analyzing qualitative data. So quantitative data analysis is the analysis of numerical data using statistical methods. So the computer software package, SPSS, is useful in the analysis of quantitative data. Compared to qualitative data analysis, it does not draw on statistics or statistical methods. This is because qualitative data is non-numerical data. So let's look at the analytical framework. So the final framework in the 4 framework approach is the analytical framework. So you as a researcher will present the analytical framework for the research project in a chapter on data analysis. So the chapter on data analysis contains a full account of the analysis carried out on the data and a complete presentation of the findings that emerge from that data analysis. So in this chapter, you present the key findings, the key data, and also the key interpretations made in relation to the data. So now let's move on to data and data management, which is very important. So data management is the correct, safe, and secure management of data while data are being gathered, stored, and analyzed. So data management is about the proper management and the protection of data. So there are many safety and security concerns in relation to data and the appropriate management of data. We have to be aware of this because data can be lost or stolen. It can become damaged in some way. Electronically or digitally stored data should be backed up. Copies should be made. And then if moving the data is unavoidable, it is wise to make a plan for the move, which anticipates as much as possible any potential risks or dangers posed to the data by the move. Next, such a plan may involve some reflection of the risks or potential risks involved in moving your data. So every researcher should have a plan in place for the organization, safety and security, and management of the data to be gathered for the research project. Okay, so this slide explains a little bit about the relation with data gathering methods and data analysis. So when you design the data gathering methods for the research project, you actually develop at the same time a sense of how the data will be analyzed. So in your research diary, you begin to develop a plan for data analysis. So if the data to be gathered are quantitative or qualitative, how will the data be analyzed? So your approach to data analysis will be determined by the kind of data that you have to analyze. So if you're analyzing quantitative data, simple and small quantitative data sets can be analyzed quite easily by simply counting the numbers and calculating simple statistics in relation to them. So this may be done in a simple pen and paper exercise or with the use of a calculator or a spreadsheet. So numbers can easily be counted and the summaries of counted numbers can be meaningful. So summarizing statistics are examples of descriptive statistics, where this is statistics that are used to describe data. So the numbers are presented in the data analysis chapter in tables and as part of a meaningful narrative. So in this slide, it explains about using SPSS. So SPSS is basically a software which is specifically designed for analysis of quantitative data. So when the participant in the research has completed and returned the questionnaire, you as a researcher, you will load the data or input the data from the questionnaire into SPSS. So when all the completed questionnaires have been loaded or inputted, the researcher then uses the package to analyze the data. So SPSS is a very powerful tool in quantitative data analysis and useful in analyzing larger data sets. So in using SPSS, the researcher first codes each response to each question in each questionnaire. So each response is coded as a number, and the numeric code or the number is then loaded or inputted into SPSS. So what about qualitative data? Qualitative data, which you know by now, are non-numeric data. So it can come in almost any form, can take the form of stated or articulated feelings, beliefs, opinions, and perspectives. So it can be in the form of narratives or stories, images, drawings, cartoons, paintings, and photographs. So there are a number of different ways in which qualitative data can be analyzed. So one simple approach to qualitative data analysis is to read through all of the data. While reading, you make a list of all the themes that occur in the data. So themes is basically what's the key points that were raised by the respondents. So the themes would be the key ideas or the key concepts that strike the researcher as she or he reads through the data transcripts. So the researcher continues reading the transcripts and recording themes until no new themes emerge. Then, the researcher takes the complete list of themes and explores them with a view to collapsing themes together. So now you're doing the filtering. So in other words, you as a researcher condense the list of themes by fitting themes together that seem logically to fit together. In this way, the list of themes becomes shorter and more manageable. So when the researcher collapses themes together, you need to conceptualize this new theme, or you need to rename it. So a theme which will encompass all of the themes collapsed together. So this process is a process called abstraction. So what you're doing is you're stepping away from the raw data and step towards an abstract or abstracted understanding of the data. So you as a researcher go through this process to get closer to the meaning of the data. So the meaning of the data in relation to the overall aim of the research. So to differentiate the different themes in a specific data set or interview transcripts, you as a researcher can use this method of color coding the themes. So for example, you can use the color red to the first theme, yellow to the second theme, green to the third theme, and so on. So you as a researcher can read through the transcripts, and it can be pages long. So to facilitate your process of differentiating which description from the interviewees talks about which theme, you can assign the colors to the parts of the data that represent each of the themes. So this way, you can see at a glance each of the themes as they are represented in the data. So next, we look at this specific software which is used for qualitative data. So it's called Computer Assisted Qualitative Data Analysis Software, and the popular one are Atlas TI and NVivo. So this software package stores the data and the analysis of the data, so there is no need for large piles of printed data. So the analysis can be done entirely on your computer, stored and backed up on your computer as well. So you will be eliminating the hard physical work of dealing with data analysis on paper, and this is a computerized approach to data analysis which is simpler and cleaner. So when the data analysis process is computerized, there is less likely of data or pages getting lost or simply missed in the analysis process. So now we focus on the story of the data. So the decisions that the researcher makes in relation to the story or the narrative are based on the overall aim of the research questions, and the objectives of the research project. So at the start of the research project, you as a researcher ask a question or the research question. So now coming to the end of the research project, what you must do is actually answer the questions. So at the start of the research project, you outline a specific aim and number of objectives. So now in the narrative of the data analysis chapter, you as a researcher must accomplish the aims and objectives. Now we move on to the 4 stages of data analysis, which will start off with the description, interpretation, conclusions, and finish off with theorization. So in the description stage, this is where you engage in descriptive analysis. So you describe the data, describing what you actually see in the data. Next, you move on to interpretation, where you move away from describing what it is, and then now you're trying to explain what the data means, okay, explaining the implications of the data. Third is where you draw conclusions from your findings. And finally, you look back at the literature review and check to see whether how similar or different their findings are with yours. Okay, so this is the final part is basically the theorization process. So for this particular chapter of data analysis, what you need to bear in mind includes all these questions. So what is the point of this chapter? What key point or argument am I making in this chapter? How well and how clearly is this point or argument made in this chapter? How well are the data used in the chapter to support the point or argument? And how well do the data support this main point or key arguments? So there are a lot of things that you need to consider, not only trying to present the data, but you have to support the findings from the data. Okay, so that's why the theorization process is important. You present what you have found and then relate back to the literature review that you have done in chapter 2. Okay, so that's all for this chapter.